Meeting is called to order.
Yeah, okay, we're good.
So I guess I need to say that again. If the recording is good, the meeting is called to order.
Yes, and it is 12:06 on Friday, October the 15th.
Do we have any guests that are out there that need to be recognized?
I think that Gilbert called him, but if anybody yourself, you're more than welcome to.
We didn't hear that. Annette, can you repeat it?
Okay. If there's anybody who would like to be recognized right now, we can do that.
As a guest?
I want to say something. This is Gisela Dagnino. I invited Enrique Ochoa. He is my backup. I don't know how that works. I don't know if we're gonna vote on that later. But sometimes when I can't make the meetings, he also be involved and help me with go through the reports, etc., and attend the meetings as well.
That's great. I know that Omar wants to have that as an agenda item sometime soon. So thank you for being proactive, Gisela. Okay, so we can go ahead and if there's any member.
Number 3, do we have any member updates? Anybody interested in providing some information to the group? Okay, let me note there was no response there. Item 4 for the RealCog.
Yes, this is the minutes from the September 7th meeting. I do need to send a few of the minutes to Javier for signature, which ones have already been approved, but if these are approved as well, I'll send them over for Javier to sign since he is serving as our secretary.
Are there any comments on the minutes? If no comments, I need a motion to accept.
So moved.
Second.
Who was the second?
Who did the second?
Gilbert Saldaña?
Okay.
Oh, Gilbert, you're on. Thank you, Gilbert.
Yes. Sorry, joined in a little late.
That's okay.
Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, motion passes. Item 5 is Texas Water Development.
Hi, everyone. This is Richard Bagans from the Water Development Board. I have a few updates. So the additional funding that was allocated by the board is now in contract amendment form and its draft form. We are hoping, I think I said this at the last week's meeting, but we are hoping to have it to the sponsors and to you all in draft form by this time, but unfortunately it's hit a few snags. But we just received news this morning that it should be going out to sponsors sometime next week for review. So keep your eyes out for that on how that additional funding will be divvied up and allocated between additional tasks. For the tech memo, just emphasizing the timeline that all the tech memo deliverables, except for the geodatabase files that were extended, are due January 7th. So most likely by your late November meeting, or if you have another meeting in December, to have all those tech memo deliverables approved so that the technical consultants can go ahead and submit that before or during the holiday break, whenever you guys feel comfortable. So in terms of that as well, I'll comment on the public notice postings, which are deliverables. The agenda items, was it 10? Brian Blaisdell had emailed me asking about the public notice posting. When you adopt or recommend the floodplain management land use standards, that is fine as a 7-day. So you guys are able to do that today. Agenda items 11 and 12. I encourage you guys to have discussion around those. But those two items do require 14-day notice requirements. So those taking action on those items can happen at your November meeting. But encouraging still discussion so that those items can be a little bit quicker at your November meeting to go over other items. And then once you guys have the budget memo approved on agenda item 7, then we can go ahead and approve the subcontract with AECOM, because we're kind of still in a holding pattern with this budget memo here. That's all the updates I have. Does anybody have any questions for me at this time?
If I can, through the chair, I think AECOM will definitely want, can you just remind us when we have the next general meeting scheduled? Has that already been identified by AECOM?
At a previous meeting, unless some AECOM wants to speak up, I have on November 2nd.
November 2nd, okay.
That's what I thought.
And actually, let me chime in on that and make sure, because I think I already sent the invite out for that one.
Okay.
I thought we were looking at, oh no, no, that's a different meeting, sorry.
No, you're right, Gilbert. So you did send it for November the 2nd. We still have time to do it 14 days in advance. So knowing that it is the 2nd, we would have to have it 1, 2, 3, 4,
Tuesday.
No, yes, by the 19th next week, we need to have our agenda ready so we can post that 14 days in advance.
I didn't get the invite for the November the 2nd meeting. Can you forward it to me, please?
Yes, we will do that.
Thank you.
I don't have it either.
I don't think we sent it yet. I think that's what,
No.
is that right, Gilbert?
Yeah, that's correct. I haven't sent it yet, so we'll get that out here so everybody can get it on their calendars.
I think that Richard will definitely be able to meet the 14-day requirement with that gentle reminder that you provided us. So appreciate it.
Any other questions for anybody? All right, that's it for me.
Okay, item 6, Sarah, can you give us an update of your liaison to Region 14?
And I don't think she's on, so
Oh, okay,
so we will not have an update.
sorry about that.
Mhm.
Okay, we'll get one next time. Okay, and number 7.
I'll give an update on Region 15 if I could, just to compare what other regions are doing. Region 15, the Lower Rio Grande, they did recently, I forget if they approved their goals, but they were discussing goals, but they do have a lot of goals. They are one of the regions with the most amount, the count of goals, and then they had something like 37 different goals. While I will compare that some other regions having somewhere between 10 and 15 goals. But your lower basin is wanting to make sure that it is all spelled out and they want to achieve a lot. So just comparing, giving that a little bit of information.
Okay, thanks.
And that's it.
Item 7.
Yes, this one here, this is an agenda item that we had, I should have presented to you some time back, and I'm sorry that I did not, but it's a requirement as per Water Development Board. I'm going to attempt to share this on the screen. Let me see if I can make that happen. Let me see. Right here. Okay. I think everybody can see that now. So this right here is,
Can you enlarge it?
yes. trying to make it bigger. Sorry, guys. This is required by Water Development Board, and this was showing the differences in the original budget versus the revised budget. And this is at the request of AECOM to be able to move some of the funding. You all have already seen this. I think it was asked by Dave previously at one of our meetings, and so I did send this out to y'all to show the shifting of the budgets to ultimately it's the same amount of money at the end of what's being awarded to Rio Grande Council governments and then being contracted out with AECOM. But now we're asking in a formal manner to receive approval by the flood planning group to for Water Development Board to receive this task budget memo. And so are there any questions for me regarding any of these items? So we just need a motion.
Yeah, we need a motion to accept.
Move to accept.
Second.
Okay.
Okay, any discussion? Okay, all in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, motion passes. I have one comment before we get off this screen. Gilbert, is it possible for you to show us at our general meetings the consumption of the budget as you guys consume funding?
Yes, we've got and actually I've got an invoice that was getting ready to send out to you guys. It's going to have that breakdown based on the tasks.
Okay, and then at some point, I think I'd like to do is add to the agenda to kind of show how the funds are used, similar to that chart that was just up there. Maybe add a column that shows what percentage of each set of funds has been consumed.
And I think we can accomplish that under the next one that we're going to be discussing. We will number 8. We can have that incorporated under 8 moving forward.
Okay.
Okay. I think we had a motion in a second.
Okay, and everybody voted already, so it's been approved.
Okay.
Okay, so you wanted to table number 8 though?
Yes. So on number 8, as Richard had mentioned previously, we're going to be having this agenda item as a standing agenda item. The anticipation is that we will be receiving reimbursement requests from AECOM on a monthly basis moving forward. And so this is what the agenda item will look like. We, if you all can imagine, there's just been a lot of activity with this program. We're not quite ready yet to ask for money, but I know that we're all getting to the point where we need to be able to get that reimbursement. So at the November 2nd meeting, you will see the documentation in terms of the request, the amount that's being requested, and then how much is being requested from each task. So at this point, there's no action to take on number 8 because we do not have any documentation to provide you.
Okay, let's move on to number 9, AECOM. Gilbert?
Thank you, Dave. I think we're going to share our screen with this one, Brian, to put the presentation, or? So thank you all again. This is the 3rd regional flood planning group meeting that we're having right now. And today we're going to cover updates that basically cover the general RFP. We're also looking at updates to subcommittees 1, 2, and 3. And if you notice to the right there, we've got the agenda item that the presentation is associated with. And again, we're going to dive into the roadshow dates and public participation. You know, provide some further dates and all that on the work that we've provided. Start again with the survey and stakeholder coordination. And at the end, we're going to give you a roadmap of what we've got left to do and what our goals are for the next meeting. So next slide. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brian Blaisdell, who's going to cover the general updates here. Brian.
All right, thanks, Gilbert. Good afternoon, everyone. So just to start off with, we wanted to just briefly talk about the ongoing flood plan survey. We did extend the survey closing date to today. Actually, our original date was a couple weeks ago. We extended that closing date with the aim to collect as many responses as possible. And I know it has been asked sort of, what does that mean when the survey closes? We won't actually be like officially or formally or functionally closing the survey. It will still be available for anyone to respond on the web. Our aim with this date was just to really try to encourage people to respond in a timely fashion by this date, so that we can maximize the number of responses that we have as we go into the next couple months in preparation for the technical memo. So we will be checking it periodically, but and we have been up till now reaching out to stakeholders that are on our list and encouraging them to respond and provide feedback. So starting next week, we will continue to reach out, but in a more selective fashion, just trying to prioritize the ones that may have the higher impact. But up till now, we have received a good number of responses. We've received about 100 or so. That was as of a couple days ago. Some of those are from individual members of the public, and then about half are from the community representatives and stakeholders. And Martin Bartlett will be sharing more later this presentation about the stakeholder outreach. So this slide I just included with the presentation. If you know anyone that may be interested in taking the survey, feel free to share this information. This slide in particular has all the information that you need to share with others, including different language versions of the survey and the interactive map. So we encourage everyone to pass this slide along as desired, and just continue to spread the word. So we have been making good progress since our last general planning group meeting. In task 1, we've continued to coordinate with USIBWC to collect data and information from various studies. We've been working with SWCA, our subconsultant, to identify threatened and endangered species and also cultural resources within the region. We've been, as I mentioned, collecting community survey responses and scheduling interviews with stakeholders who've requested that. And we also noted that Aqua Strategies, who's been working with TWDB on the Fathom data set, did submit that updated data set, the 3-meter resolution data set, to TWDB on September 29th. And so we understand that's currently under review and may be released relatively soon for use, which will be helpful outside El Paso County throughout the rest of the region. So then in task 2, we've been reviewing and implementing a flood risk analysis approach based on feedback that was received during subcommittee 3. There are going to be different methods within El Paso County, where we're going to be primarily using the FEMA 2D preliminary mapping boundaries. And then outside of El Paso County, we'll be utilizing a combination, well, primarily the Fathom data set, because that's will be one of the most significant grid sources of grid depth grid information that we can use for our exposure analysis. But we're working to see exactly how we can combine those two data sets, and also implementing any other data sets from other studies as we find them. But those are the two primary approaches that we'll be utilizing. For task 3, we met with the subcommittee 1 on September 30th and started to discuss the issues with the floodplain management current standards and practices throughout the region. we're continuing to refine those the discussion of the minimum standards, whether to adopt those as a group or not, as well as the goals, refining those goals, and those will be presented at a later planning group meeting as recommendations. Our current target is to have the goals as well as the task for process for identifying FMEs, FMPs, and FMSs posted by by mid-November, I think November 15th, and that will be 2 weeks prior to the November 30th RFPG meeting, in which we will have our formal votes on all of those, on the goals and and that process that will be implemented or laid out in the technical memo. So then in task 4, we are identifying FMEs, FMSs, FMPs while we're also laying out that process. We have been discussing through the subcommittee for sort of a general approach. We're refining that as we go, and still collecting information on the available studies in the region. So we're making progress on that, developing the needs analysis based on what we know so far from our flood exposure review, and that we've also met the 2 subcommittees, subcommittee 2 and 3, which include all of the FMEs, FMSs, and FMPs, and those met. Actually, subcommittee 2 met earlier this week, and then the subcommittee 3 on the FMEs and FMSs met late September. Just as an idea that came up with respect to that interactive flood map that we're using through the stakeholder survey, one of our proposed FMSs is to take that approach and utilize a interactive.
We just stopped.
I think we lost Brian, his internet connection.
This was one that they just commented on just now, that Brian just commented on. It's one in the future that we don't know about yet.
Okay.
Sorry, we'll text Brian, let him know on the side that he's still talking. We are not hearing him. This is Chris Wright with AECOM. I guess this might be a good moment to just pause and see if there are any comments on what Brian has presented so far.
I have a question on the open house meeting this month. It's scheduled for October 27th. What time is it going to be held? I haven't received an invitation. I don't know if you guys are already coordinating with our communications department at AP Water, or what the status of that is.
Yes, they've coordinated with the people there at the H2O Tech Center. The meeting is going to take place from 4 to 7, and I know we're going to give you a little more information here as we move along the presentation. But I thought.
I had one comment that I wanted to make. Did anybody receive any feedback from the draft memorandum that was put out for the Chapter 1 attachment that Jeff put out? Jeff Irvin put out draft comparison of Fathom floodplain, etc. Were there any comments or feedback on that?
Not that I'm aware of, Dave.
Okay. I just wondered. I thought it was kind of an interesting document, and I just wondered if anybody said anything back on it. Okay, because it was listed as a draft, and I thought maybe somebody might have made comments.
Apologize, I didn't even have my camera on.
Everyone, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, Brian, you're back.
Apologize for that. That's very strange.
Well, I just had a board meeting for 2 hours where nobody heard virtually, so you're okay. You're doing good.
I think you have to
Okay.
share your screen again, Brian.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian. Share your screen and we'll pick up.
I'll do that right here. Okay, can you hear me and see my screen?
Yep, we're good to go.
Okay. So I think I was in the middle of talking about this when I started hearing feedback about the call dropping. I'll just go over this again. So one of our ideas for the FMSs was for taking the interactive flood map as a kind of taking inspiration from the interactive web map that we developed for the stakeholders. We would potentially expand that, and local communities or at the region-wide level, residents can utilize some similar tools to respond after flood events, and really serve as a way to collect information that is really valuable from a modeling perspective. So that will be one of our FMSs, but just wanted to highlight that here as another way to plug the interactive flood map. It has been really interesting to see the different responses that we've received through there, and different photos so far. So don't know if you all already talked about the open house meeting later this month, but we are scheduled for October 27th at the EP Water Tech H2O Center, and we're preparing our materials for that. And Martin will talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. So I will pass this off to Christine Westerman from SWCA to just talk briefly about this threatened and endangered species.
What bird is in the picture?
I'm sorry?
Looks like a western yellow-billed cuckoo.
That is correct.
Okay.
Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. So as far as threatened and endangered species, we have obviously, with the number of counties that we're dealing with, we have quite a few federally listed and dozens of state listed species, as well as over 300 species of greatest conservation need that have been identified by the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. So what we wanted to do here was identify some of the species that we think are most likely to be the main issues for flood planning projects in the Region 14 area. Those species that we're focusing on are species that could occur in the rivers and streams and in riparian areas, and also associated with springs, because we felt those were most likely to be affected by flood projects. So the species shown on this slide are all federally listed species. The western yellow-billed cuckoo and the southwestern willow flycatcher are both songbirds that occur in riparian woodlands along streams. The Texas horned shell, you might have heard of, is a federally endangered listed freshwater mussel, and the horned shell occurs in the Rio Grande, in the Pecos River and the Devils River, and also possibly tributaries. So that's a species that could be quite extensive in the Region 14 area. And then we also have a few spring-dependent species. Those habitats for those species are likely to be very isolated and just associated with small springs. For example, in Balmorhea, or in springs, primarily in Pecos and Brewster County. Are there any questions on any of these species? Is this the only slide I have, Brian?
Yes,
Okay.
Cool.
And I just want to
Thanks.
let y'all know that when we start actually looking at individual flood projects, that we would do background reviews based on GIS analysis to try to determine if that project area is likely to have an impact on any of these species, and then let you know about potential permitting issues associated with that.
Great. Thanks, Christine.
Sure.
All right. I will briefly summarize some updates from Subcommittee 1, and then Chris Wright will follow with some updates on Subcommittees 2 and 3. So with Subcommittee 1, as I mentioned earlier, we met at the end of September, and this slide was revised a little bit from the slide version that we presented during that subcommittee, but what our findings are that about 75% of all eligible communities are currently participating in the NFIP throughout the region. That includes about 80% of counties and 73% of incorporated places, cities, towns, and villages. The areas that are not participating are primarily Reeves and Pecos County, as well as a few. We have Winkler County in the northeast, and then small portions of Andrews and Edwards counties along the edges of the region. In terms of the non-participating communities, and the reason why this is important to note is one, these communities will have less availability for flood insurance through the federal flood insurance program, and so they may be more at risk or exposed to the damages from flooding. They may also have fewer or be less prepared for dangerous flooding events. And in addition, when the RFPG talks later about potentially adopting minimum standards across the region, these are the communities that maybe may potentially be excluded depending on what standards the RFPG chooses to adopt. So again, Reeves and Pecos County come up here, and within those, there's several unincorporated places: Lindsay, Coyanosa, Imperial, and Sheffield, and then there's several incorporated places sort of distributed throughout the region listed here. Some examples of so even though that these communities don't participate in the NFIP, they still could potentially be at risk of flooding. So one example is in Barstow City. This was in the northeast part of, or between Reeves County and Ward County. It's actually pretty predominantly located within the 1% annual chance regulatory floodplain, as represented by the FAFDS data set. And that's representing the old physical firm maps. So they are potentially at risk, although this data set this flood map is quite old. In addition, there are several communities that are not participating near a fathom floodplain, and this one is shown here is Sheffield. This actually doesn't show too much of a risk, although it's near the floodplain. But I did want to mention the city of Kermit does have quite a bit of overlap with the Fathom data set, which I didn't show in this presentation since we're still waiting for the official Fathom data set to be released for use. So I didn't want to show anything there that would show potential impacts that are not official yet. And so these are just kind of to show representations of flood risk and how even if a community is not participating in the NFIP, they still may be exposed to risk. We talked briefly in the subcommittee 1 meeting about the NFIP requirements, how they're based on what the different specific requirements are based on which flood hazard areas are defined for a given community. So if a community does not have a flood hazard defined, they fall within, they have their own specific requirements for the NFIP. Whereas if the community has a detailed flood map available with elevations, flood elevations and depths, they have another or more rigorous set of requirements that they have to meet in order to participate in the NFIP. And that those requirements are scaled that way to acknowledge that there is still some uncertainty across the U.S. With respect to flood risk. Communities that where flood risk is less, information is less available, will not be able to, may not be able to implement the level of floodplain management practices as a community that has more detailed flood information. But it's more the community's participation in the NFIP is more about how they use the information that is available to protect the community and prepare against future risk. So it's those minimum requirements are based on that special flood hazard type. In addition, the NFIP, the regulations state that if the local community has more strict or restrictive regulations, those are encouraged and take precedence. So local communities are encouraged to go above those requirements. And in addition, if communities do exceed minimum requirements, they can be eligible to participate in the CRS program, which allows for insurance discounts. Most communities will enter the program at a CRS Class 9 or Class 8, and that's the starting point for this program. But acknowledging that these communities are exceeding the minimum requirements, and City of El Paso is Class 9, which receives a 5% discount on flood insurance premiums. And you can move up in your class rating based on completion of different floodplain management activities. So we talked a little bit before about RFPG minimum standards. So just real quick to differentiate, minimum standards would be standards that RFPG could adopt now that communities would need to adopt. These standards would apply across the region that communities would need to adopt in order to participate or include FMEs, FMSs, or FMPs in the flood plan. This is listed out in the scope of work for the flood plan, gives the RFPG the authority to set these minimum standards. Doesn't say specifically what those standards would be, and they would not be regulatory in nature, but more would be an incentive, would serve as an incentive for communities to adopt those minimum standards in order to include an FME, FMS, or FMP in the flood plan and receive funding for those needs through this process. So we talked at our last meeting the pros and cons of adopting some minimum standards. Again, those minimum standards would be defined in later subcommittee meetings. But of course, if the minimum standards are adopted, some pros are the RFPG would use its authority as the owner of the flood plan to guide practices in the region. So it's a way to encourage those practices and serve as another incentive for communities. And it would allow the flood plan funding to be used in an efficient manner for communities who are adopting those minimum standards. On the other hand, as was discussed in our subcommittee 1 update, or in our subcommittee 1 meeting, by adopting minimum standards, it could potentially exclude communities that don't meet those minimum standards, regardless of the reasons, and they would not be eligible to receive funding for those FMEs, FMSs, or FMPs. in this cycle. It could be they're able to receive funding in later cycles if they meet those minimum standards. I'll pause here real quick and just see if anyone has any questions about those slides. If no questions, we also talked about short-term and long-term goals. And we discussed a few different goal ideas, but are still refining that process. And as I mentioned, our target is to post those goals for public review by November 15th. And our next subcommittee 1 meeting will be next Thursday on October 21st. So even though the agenda has some actions to vote, we're tabling those actions for this RFPG meeting, and we'll revisit them in a later meeting. Chris, you can go ahead and I guess we have them. We can rather present subcommittee 3 or 2 next.
I'll stick to subcommittee 3.
Okay.
Okay, I understand. Just for the agenda, that means that item number 10 is tabled at this point?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I will give a brief overview of subcommittee, the first meeting of subcommittee 3, which took place on September 30th. The attendees are shown here, and we selected Sal Massoud as the chair of that subcommittee. And we did have, I'll note, we had a couple special guests, Dr. Blair from the EPC WID number 1, the district engineer there, and as well as Dr. Bora and Ramon Macias from USIBWC. Next slide. So we discussed one particular issue that has come up in some of our general RFPG meetings, and that is related to the FEMA accredited levees in the region. And in particularly, I know it's a controversial subject in El Paso County, where the preliminary FEMA floodplains are coming out soon. Well, they're already out, but they will be becoming effective in the near future. And wherever there are not FEMA accredited levees, there will be mapping shown on the official floodplains, which assumes that the levee is not there. So in other words, all the levees along the Rio Grande throughout El Paso, which protect a significant portion of the city, the flow is going to be allowed to, per the models that were developed, the flow would be allowed to leave the Rio Grande. And so for mapping purposes, there are several large areas adjacent to the Rio Grande that will be in the floodplain. And there were some comments in these general RFPG meetings about whether our flood risk maps developed as part of this regional flood plan would consider the levees there or not. And we pointed out that there is an item in the scope of work which states that non-accredited levees for this regional flood plan flood risk analysis should not be considered, or in other words, they should be modeled the same way as in the FEMA studies, which assume that the levees are not there. So that is how we're going to assess existing flood risk. However, when we evaluate certain FMSs or FMPs, and we're estimating the benefits associated with those, if those have to do with getting the levees accredited, for example, we would need certain models to demonstrate what that would look like on the other side of those levees, on the landward side of those levees. And so that's a little bit about what we talked about in this subcommittee 3 meeting is how would what models would we use if we were to come up with a flood management strategy, say, for example, where we raised the levees or got the levees accredited, how would we measure the benefits? How many houses would be removed from the floodplain if a levee became accredited? So we'll talk a little bit more about that here in the next slides.
Just a question before you go on to the next slide. Who is responsible for the accreditation?
So there are several check boxes that need to be addressed that are largely associated with US IBWC responsibilities, since they manage and maintain the levees and the sediment and vegetation within the Rio Grande. That was one of the reasons we focused this particular meeting on the main stem of the Rio Grande issues. We wanted US IBWC and some of their technical staff to be present and involved in this conversation. So it does involve demonstrating several aspects of those levees are meeting the FEMA standards. And so basically, there's a package that's put together, and it would involve the geotechnic. It would say, okay, we meet these FEMA standards for geotechnical integrity, and here's the documentation that we're meeting those standards. We meet the FEMA standards for freeboard, minimum freeboard of 3 feet, for example, and here's the model and the report that show that we have 3 feet of freeboard for the 100-year. So there's all these check boxes. Another one of those is the interior drainage study, which is a study of the local rainfall on the landward side of the levees. And basically you have to have a map that's ready that says, okay, if this levee becomes accredited, what's the new floodplain going to look like? Well, you need an interior drainage study to do that. And so that's another one of the check boxes. So FEMA is ultimately responsible for approving the certification package. And once the levees are certified, they can then become accredited. And then that's when the FEMA floodplain maps get revised, and you would see several areas get removed from the floodplain, or at least the floodplain zone would change for those particular houses or buildings that are at risk behind the levees.
Okay, just Rick Tate is not present in the meeting, so we don't have our River Authority guy hearing this. There's a new commissioner that I just read about in the paper. It might be a great time for someone to toss this at the IBWC and see what their response is.
Yes, they were present at our subcommittee meeting, and what you'll see is that several of these next slides focus on issues directly related to levee accreditation in the Rio Grande, and so we have had some discussions with Delbert, who's here on the call today, and he did mention that they have a new commissioner at the US IBWC, and so we're making sure to coordinate with Delbert, and they've been very helpful in providing a lot of information that we've requested so far. So yeah, if we get to the point where we think it's beneficial and the right time to set up a meeting with the new commissioner, we'll certainly propose that to Delbert. Delbert, do you have any comments or responses?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. Dr. Bora in our engineering services division is the main contact for the levee accreditation process. He did provide some figures to the group showing the accreditation status of the different levee segments. And if we need to dig into that at all, I can definitely reach out to them and provide more details. But I do know, you did mention the interior drainage study. That is not IBWC. That's outside of our domain. But we do manage the submission packets to FEMA for levee accreditation with stuff within our domain.
It looks like Sal has a question. Sal?
Well, it's more of an enforcement a notation. I know I am on the Citizens Advisory Board at the IBWC, and I know they circulated a memo regarding the open house meeting that we're going to be having soon. So I'm sure some of the members will be attending, and some of the IBWC staff will be attending. It would be a good idea to call a meeting before then, at least not wait till the open house meeting. We can meet with them and coordinate. But yes, the certification and the accreditation process of the levies has been going on for a good part of 12 years. It's a very lengthy process. IBWC is responsible for the submittal to FEMA, but the interior drainage studies is just based on the communities adjacent to that levee from the interior. They have to submit their paperwork so IBWC can continue with the submittal process. So it does take a long time. And I wanted to mention one thing that in that subcommittee 3 that we talked about is we wanted to look at the Fathom report just to see what assumptions they've made. And in reading that memo, there's certain parts that I just don't see. They do say that they implement the levies, but then they say only consider the levies that are on the national levy database. So that says the same thing that we're just talking about, that we're only going to consider the levies that are accredited, and the ones that are not going to consider not existent. So my question at the end, making it shorter, do we have any kind of leverage as this flood planning group? Can we instruct the ACOM, our contractor, to actually consider doing a model with the levees existing as a structure, since it does offer a certain level of protection? As we all know, historically, we haven't had any floods in that area because these levees have been constructed to a high standard, better than maybe a sand dune or a natural existing mound that could have been considered because of the topography of the LIDAR. That's my question. Can we instruct them to do that, or we have no choice but not to consider the levees?
So this is Jeff Irvin. Just very briefly, we are constrained in estimating current risk to not use the levees. When we go into what our actions are, we will model the existing levees. So basically what we're going to have is what the current risk is without the levees. We're constrained by our scope of work to do that. But when we go into assigning benefits to projects, we have to say what the benefits are of getting the levees up to certification. So there's going to be a huge benefit to bringing it up to certification. So in terms of the cost benefit that's associated with our projects that are recommended by the district, by the planning group, there's going to be a huge benefit associated with getting the levees to certification, which I think is what these requirements on not considering the levees are trying to do. Does that make sense? We will be modeling it with the levees.
But just for comparison, not for official map issue.
Not for defining existing risk.
Okay. And have we found any information, or had anybody pried at how are we going to deal with the model when the river runs between the United States and Mexico, since the modeling of the flood is based on assuming that one levee collapses and the other one stays on, and vice versa. But in this case, we have no information on the Mexican side levees.
Yeah, I'll respond to that one. So we did discuss that in this subcommittee meeting that I'm kind of reviewing right now. That was a very good point that was brought up, and I have reached out to Richard here, who's on the line, and requested that we set up a meeting to discuss these issues in detail. We've sent them a detailed agenda of the very specific and complex, politically sensitive issues that you're referring to, which do involve the Rio Grande levees on both the Mexican and the American side, and what assumptions we should make with regard to when flow gets high enough to whether it's overtopping the Mexico or the American sides. Do we assume that one of the levees breaches at that point? That has a big effect on risk, and we want to be consistent with how they are assuming that overtopping or those breaches occur in other parts of the state. You know, we're not the only section that has the Rio Grande and the Mexico border within our region. So that's one of the reasons we reached out to the Texas Water Development Board. Richard, do you have anything to add to
that? So during this meeting, I just got an email from my supervisor that they're going to draft up a written response to all the questions and assumptions that the technical consultant submitted. And additionally, we'll try to set up a meeting either next week or the following to discuss further.
Great, thank you. All right, with that, any other questions before we move on? All right, so I'll try to wrap up this overview, but one of the documents that we identified was a report by the Joint Committee study, which sorry, I don't have the exact reference shown in this slide, but it was a document that involved a technical committee, which was led by Dr. Blair out of the EPC WID #1, and it was recently released in, I believe it was 2019, and it outlined several issues related to flooding of the Rio Grande. One of those issues was that there are segments where there are not actual levees, but rather railroad embankments that are acting as the highest confining terrain. So they're sort of acting as a levee, but they aren't constructed for that purpose. So it points out where those railroad sections are, and there is modeling of the Rio Grande 1% annual chance flood, and it does show overtopping in some of those sections where there are railroads serving as levees, and it doesn't delineate the extent of flooding on the other side of those levees, but it's because really you would need a 2D model to do that, but it does have an approximate flood extent. It also talks a little bit about some of the uncertainties associated with peak flows in the Rio Grande, and it considers a range of flows that are based on several different resources, studies that were identified in that report, and the one which shows overtopping of certain levees, it does assume higher flows than some of the flows considered by some of the recent USIBWC or FEMA studies. Next slide. So some of those uncertainties relate to the Rio Grande hydrology, which I just mentioned. Well, some of the models of the Rio Grande, for example, in the preliminary FEMA models that are out, they're based on previous models from originally starting back from 1999 that underwent updates in 2005, which were then updated again in 2018, 2017. But there are some assumptions back from those original models in 1999, which may still be present in the most recent models related to flow leaving the Rio Grande levee system through agricultural drains, which has since been constructed with gates. So those gates may now be blocking flow from leaving the Rio Grande, but they may still be incorporated in the models of the Rio Grande. So this is important because, you know, the flows that we saw in that sedimentation study by the Joint Committee, those were fairly low flows that still consider those gates and the flow leaving, those gates basically not being there and flow leaving the Rio Grande. So if we were to model those gates being there, it could significantly increase the flows in Rio Grande and increase the amount of overtopping that's possible. There's other factors such as the Caballo Dam flood releases from upstream. There has to be coordination between those that operate the Caballo Dam and those that operate the gates along the Rio Grande outfalls down in El Paso, for example. And If there is a large storm that's expected to hit El Paso, they might communicate to the operators of Caballo Dam, you need to stop releases or reduce the flow coming out of the Caballo Dam upstream. Now that could take 3 days to come into effect, but that's an important operational protocol that we need to understand, and that may be, potential FMS that we discuss is improving the coordination and really making sure we understand exactly what that coordination looks like. We also discussed there's a bulking factor for sediment in the Rio Grande. So depending on how much sediment there is, that can change the water surface elevation quite a bit. That affects the hydrology as well. There is new statistical rainfall that's become available in the recently with NOAA Atlas 14 in Texas, and there's also NOAA data that was released for New Mexico, after some of these studies were first started. So there's updated rainfall data, and there's also how to consider levees that are overtopped. Do you consider just the flow that gets over the top of those levees, or do you assume that those levees will breach when you're trying to measure flood risk for either existing or proposed conditions? Next slide. All right, and some of the Rio Grande hydraulic issues that we brought up were, we talked a lot about this already, but there has been sediment built up in the Rio Grande. It's something that changes year to year, and it's highly dependent on maintenance within the Rio Grande of clearing out that sediment. And the other factor is there's been significant vegetation growing on some of the islands in the Rio Grande, which makes a very large difference in the conveyance capacity, especially if you've seen some of the vegetation in the past. Certain areas, it can be dense and tall enough to where it can completely block flow. So that was another subject that's discussed in that joint committee meeting. And there was a model that was developed there, which included 2020 or at least 2019 LIDAR. It's very recent LIDAR. And it also modeled the vegetation in detail. So that was understood to be the best available model at this time, although there are some ongoing studies which will release updated models in August of 2022. Next slide. So due to all these different variables with the Rio Grande, there could be a potential FMS, which involves Rio Grande levee accreditation. And in order to come up with the benefits for that FMS, we would need a model of the Rio Grande, and the best available model that we know of and that we've discussed with USIBWC at this time at least seems to be that joint committee studies model. So that would probably be used to measure the flows in the Rio Grande, knowing that those flows could change because, like I said, there is an ongoing study that will be released in August of 2022. But it could be used at least for now to see, okay, well, based on this range of 1% flows and based on this range of sediment accumulation, depending on, our discussions with IBWC about what are the appropriate assumptions to make regarding sediment or vegetation maintenance, we could come up with maybe a range of heights that the levees should be adjusted to in order to become accredited in the future. And then we could also prioritize which segments become accredited. So this is a strategy that we discussed, and eventually it can be used to develop FMPs, and those FMPs would be, for example, raising the levees, and the FMS could involve guidance on sedimentation or vegetation clearing. That's just an example, but that's what we discussed. Next slide. And so we did vote at the end of the meeting on some general approach guidelines. We were hoping to vote on that today because we weren't really considering this the official process, but rather an approach. So we didn't think it needed the 14-day lead time, but we understand that it is related and can fit in that category. So we can officially vote on that at the next general RFPG meeting. But basically, the modeling approach that we presented at the end and voted upon and approved in the subcommittee meeting to then present to you all here for official voting and approval by the regional flood planning group is that there is a need for revised hydrology and hydraulics for the Rio Grande. That would be a useful flood management evaluation, an FME that we think is valuable. And second, we think that we should create an FMS with the following assumptions. Upstream of American Dam, which is where that joint committee model was focused. Like I said, we could run a range of sensitivity studies with various H&H assumptions. And just wanted to reiterate that when we look at what is the existing risk, we won't have the levees in place because that, again, that's one of our scope requirements. And actually that's gonna just add to the benefits that we'll receive or that will show when we actually model it with the levees in place. And we will seek clarity with Texas Water Development Board, which we just talked about. It sounds like TWDB is going to be responding to our list of questions, and then we may even set up a meeting afterwards if we feel like it's necessary. Downstream of American Dam, which is downstream of that joint committee study, we'll still have to coordinate with USIBWC to select the best available models. Since the subcommittee meeting, they actually sent us their 1D HEC-RAS model in that location, so that's currently under review, and we're gonna be getting back to USIBWC with our thoughts on that. And then lastly, we do want to consider the El Paso County interior drainage study. So we did an interior drainage study in 2021 of the whole county of El Paso. So we have been talking with the county and with EP Water, as well as with FEMA. In fact, we had a meeting last week to talk about, how can we get FEMA to review this interior drainage study and make sure that they don't have any significant comments on the methods and the models that were developed, so that when the time comes for the levees to be accredited, it'll be as smooth of a process as possible. And so we've had some initial discussions with FEMA on that, and we are making progress. It looks like maybe a phased conditional letter of map revision might be the best approach, but that's something that's still being worked out and coordinated. And lastly, mapping downstream of El Paso County, we will likely need to use the Fathom models. And we had a discussion actually with Fathom early this week, some of the modelers in England, and we talked about some of their assumptions related to levees, which I know just came up in a question a few minutes ago. That is something that I don't think at this point that we're going to need to ask them to run certain scenarios with the Fathom modeling for our purposes. I think we can actually use some of the results that will be available. Some are already available right now, but they're not official, as Brian mentioned. But they have two sets of data. They have pluvial with a P flooding, and they have fluvial with an F, as in flight. So the fluvial is with an F, and that is the river flooding, right? But the pluvial with a P, that's overland flooding. And we think that we could probably use that overland flooding data set as the interior drainage modeling for modeling our benefits outside of El Paso County. We know that within El Paso County, we have those interior drainage models. So that's the approach that we talked about and that was approved at this subcommittee meeting. Sorry that wasn't super brief, but there was a lot that was discussed there. So any questions on this before I jump into subcommittee 2 updates?
Hey, Chris, Dave.
Hey,
Was there any overtopping of any of the levies, the non-certified and the certified levies in 6, 8, or this past year, 19?
I don't believe so. You're saying in the recent flooding in 2021 you're talking about?
Well, all the way back to 06 and 08 when we had the big flood in 06. From my point of view,
okay.
there was no overtopping in any of those, and the flooding was internal toward the levees instead of levee protection of the river.
Right. Yeah. So Gisela might have some more insight on this, but I know that we did look into that when we were preparing the interior drainage study for El Paso County, and I believe that there weren't any locations where it was overtopping, but there were some locations where it was getting close, I believe, where the waters were getting pretty high within the Rio Grande floodway. And it was an important thing to discuss because we did a coincidence analysis, which means we analyzed, what is the likelihood of the 100-year storm occurring in the Rio Grande at the same time as there's a 100-year storm on the interior local watershed of El Paso. And we actually found that it was pretty unlikely based on the historical data that's available when we look at the whole Rio Grande watershed south of Caballo Dam. But again, it depends on how much flow is being released from Caballo Dam. And so anyways, just to make a long story short, we came to the conclusion that it is still unlikely that there would be a coincidence flood, but the reason the flows got so high within the Rio Grande in 2006 were largely due to the interior flooding that would get discharged into the Rio Grande through outfalls, which then raised the levels within the Rio Grande. So I know that's kind of a complex answer, but our understanding was that yes, they did get high in the Rio Grande. I don't know of any locations where it actually overtopped, but it did get close, and there was some sediment issues also in the Rio Grande, I believe, at that time, and so that was also another factor to consider.
You're correct, Chris. To my knowledge, they didn't overtop, but they did come very close to it.
And we're talking about even the unaccredited levees never overtopped either, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that was my understanding.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the point that I was trying to drive, is that historically we've never had a flood, and to have large sectors of the El Paso populated areas be put under flood. It's not just the insurance rates that I'm worried about. It's the lack of growth that we're gonna suffer for years if this thing gets implemented. Already El Paso is the slowest growing city in the state of Texas, and we're not getting funds. We might even lose a portion of Fort Bliss because of that. And I would hate to see a large sector of El Paso that is populated be put under flood, and then therefore just crippling the development and the growth in that area. It's just really a sensitive issue, guys. That's why I'm thinking we should really think very hard about trying to get these levees somehow, somewhat considered.
Yep, we definitely understand it is a very controversial subject, and we'll just reiterate that the flood risk, the existing flood risk maps that we're creating as part of this regional flood plan, they are not the regulatory flood maps. They are separate from the FEMA maps. There's no, official agreement or expectation that the existing flood risk maps we develop as part of this study will one day become the FEMA maps that are accepted or effective. We can't change the rules that FEMA applies when they're mapping, and we are also constrained to our scope of work specific for this study, because keep in mind, we're part of a larger flood plan for the whole state of Texas. So all the other regions are making these same assumptions when it comes to levies and accreditation. And one thing I was going to mention is that in our discussions with Fathom, they did give us a little bit more insight about how they are considering levies, and it doesn't look like it's 100% based on if they're accredited or not accredited. It's actually seems to be based on the National Levee Database, and there's a annual percent chance storm that's included in the National Levee Database for each of those levee segments, and there's also a service area for each levee segment. So we just talked about some of those assumptions and tried to clarify, how we might be able to use those models, and what assumptions are they using in levees that are considered to be protected for the 0.01% chance, and then what about for other storm events such as the 0.2% chance, the 500-year storm, which needs to be mapped as part of our study. How would they be considered for that? So we had a good discussion, and we're thankful that we have Aqua Strategies on our team and was able to facilitate that discussion. So we'll be continuing to coordinate with them on how the best way to utilize their models, because like we mentioned, that's a big part of our region is this area with no updated mapping other than those models. So there's either no mapping period or there's very outdated mapping. So that's a big part of our study. So just want to make that point. But I think if there's no other questions, we'll jump into the subcommittee 2 meeting. Brian, next slide.
Okay. Chris, can I just ask a quick question for Richard? Richard, just to clarify, is there any issue with having an action to vote with this particular slide here, given that it's not the official process for identifying FMSs, FMEs, or FMPs, or?
I don't see a glaring reason against it, since it's not part of the full package. If you're voting on the full package of identifying the process, I would say that is the piece that needs the full 14 days.
Okay.
Can I suggest one thing for the next meeting, maybe? Then what Chris had suggested or talked about, the difference between how Fathom is considering the levies. And I read that in there where they're saying, basically it should be noted that the levies in particular are implemented in the Fathom model, but then they go on to say they're only considering the ones that in the USACE National Levee Database. So can we get more information on which of those levees in our area that are actually on that database?
Yeah, so I looked at the National Levee Database, and it does have the whole Rio Grande system through El Paso County, if I'm not mistaken, as protected for the 1% annual chance. So there is a service area which is basically like a polygon adjacent to the levees on the landward side of El Paso, which is not considered flooded in the fluvial flooding, which again is the riverine flooding with an F. And so even though there are segments within there that are not accredited, and we know that there's one segment that is accredited by FEMA, but basically that whole system is in there as being protected by the 1% annual chance. And so there is a service area for all of Rio Grande in that Fathom data set that is showing protection from those levees. So that was
So-
part of the discussion. recently.
The Fathom data set is not relevant to the El Paso County. It's just not
Right.
relevant, right? So this whole discussion on Fathom only pertains to the counties downstream of El Paso. So inside El Paso, Fathom will not be relevant.
Right,
Inside
and
El
that's
Paso
just
County.
because there
Yeah,
are
Carl,
updated
just
models.
don't discuss it anymore. Let's go on to the next slide.
Well, then, based on what Richard said, do we need a motion to accept the proposed approach to floodplain modeling? Is that what you said we could do, Richard?
I don't see any thing barring you from making a motion.
Okay, well, we're not accepting any kind of standards, so can we get a motion to accept the proposed approach to floodplain modeling with respect to the levees?
So before we say this for a second, let me just point out that you're going to have to phrase that you want to consider the existing levees in the definition of existing risk, which is a different issue than saying that we're just going to model the floodplains with the levees. But the problem is it states it's hardwired in our scope of work that we can't consider levees that aren't accredited. If you want to make a recommendation, which I think is what Richard's trying to do, that we need to define the existing risk, assuming the existing levees are there, then that's basically a motion to change our scope of work as it's defined with the Water Development Board.
Well,
It's just,
let me just clarify something, Jeff. We have in here this section right here, unaccredited levees will not be included in definition of existing risk.
I know, and that's what they're trying to change. They're trying to change that requirement. They aren't, I think, isn't that what you all are trying to do? Or because I think we will be considering the levees in everything other than defining existing risk. But we won't be including it in defining existing risk if we're dealing with future projects or future strategies. It's only in the maps that say what the risk is that are going to be used to define what the damages are associated with a flood in the existing condition.
Right. So just to clarify, what we were planning on proposing to vote on is this slide, which basically talks about what Jeff just said, is that, you know,
I know you're getting off what they wanted to do, Chris. What they want to do is they want to not do what this second bullet is. That's what they want. That's what the discussion has all been about, I think.
I mean, defining they being the group in its entirety.
Well, Sal, I think what you were talking about is that you wanted the risk to be defined using the existing levees in place, as opposed to saying as opposed to our current scope of work, which says because they're not accredited, you have to remove them.
I think it's a subject that we are debating as a group, as a planning group. That's one. To end the discussion arbitrarily just like that, because it's taking too long, maybe something that we need to talk about. However, when you see that the Fathom study, which is a group that you all are happy to have them on your side, have taken certain other parts of Texas and they've considered levees that are possibly not accredited, but yet listed on the national levee database, and they considered it for the model. I see under it says that El Paso vicinity area that they have recent studies, but I don't see particularly where it says it does not apply. So I don't know. I mean, it seems like we're picking and choosing what we do. And when we discuss this issue, that why the Texas Development Board is doing this is to develop their risk management in the entire state of Texas. At one point, this could be actually incorporated into the national flood maps. Eventually, that data could be shared with FEMA, and so we can take data.
Okay, so
right?
if I may, I think if we're gonna define existing risks, we need to define them as they are currently reviewed by FEMA. So FEMA does not take any of the levies that are not certified into account. So that's a risk. If there was to be NFIP in other areas, they're gonna go with whatever FEMA uses. So to identify risk, it would be whatever FEMA is using right now. Now these models, to my understanding, they're not gonna be taken into account by FEMA whenever they do a study of the area. So right now, identify risks is without the levies. That's the worst case scenario. We can identify projects to fix those issues, and we can apply for grants in the future if these are identified in the plan. If these risks are not identified, and if there's no project to mitigate these risks, then we will not be able to submit for funding if they're not identified in the plan. That's my understanding. Is that correct, Richard?
To be completely honest, this is more technical than what I am able to comment on. In terms of process, how I'm seeing it is I have the list of questions, several questions from the consultants that I need to get my supervisors and our data people to answer on.
So to me, the worst case scenario is to model them as being unaccredited. That way we can come up with solutions to address those risks. And if FEMA doesn't, or because FEMA is tied to federal regulations, if the regulations aren't changed, FEMA is not going to model those levies as being in place if they're not accredited. So no matter whatever study we do here, if FEMA doesn't change those regulations, then we're not going to have a mitigation plan for whatever areas are at risk. So that's how I see it. That's my technical advice to all of us, to model them as a worst case scenario, and then later on, AECOM will model the levies as being accredited, and we'll be able to determine how many properties are being moved out of the flood zone, and that'll be we will have some technical report to show Congress or whomever we need to provide this information to, so that they hopefully we can get more work done on the levies and be able to bring people out of the flood zone. But if we don't have this information, then we have no way of supporting what we want to be done in these areas.
Agreed.
Yeah, I'll just say, Stella, that's exactly our interpretation and an understanding of the flood planning intent is to model existing risk as worst case scenario based, well, as best available, using best available information. But in the case of the levy accreditation, using what FEMA accepts as a definition of risk for existing conditions as a baseline that will then be compared against the project scenarios, such as accrediting levies to remove houses and seeing benefits from that.
Sal, this is Dave again. I understand your agenda. What I'm asking here is, in accordance with the way the slide is stated, that the unaccredited levies will not be included in definition of existing risk. We can't change the statement of work. So, you know, for the contractor at this point, and obviously there are strategies required down the road to try to get levies accredited that aren't accredited. Can we accept and do a motion to propose this approach, assuming that will be left out of this motion?
what Isela had mentioned does make a lot of sense, and what everybody was saying actually makes a lot of sense. That FEMA, if FEMA is the authority that has that one particular item in their bylaws, that unaccredited levies will not be considered, period. And that's the case, then I think that's the way to move forward. However, my question was, for the whole purpose of us doing that for the entire state of Texas, was there any points in there that at one point these maps will be shared and could be used by FEMA to establish flood-based maps? That's my question. Does anybody know an answer to that at any point?
I mean, with this,
Go ahead. From the TWDB standpoint, I mean, the final maps will all be publicly posted and publicly accessible, but none of this is regulatory in any effect.
Okay, in that case, you know, if the group agrees to move forward with approving the scope of work as proposed on this slide in front of us, you know, to keep the momentum going, you know, I would agree with the group.
and just one last point I'll make, just so that it's clear, is that there was a slight edit to the very last bullet here, which, Brian, if I can just share my screen for a second here, I can show you, what it said before. But it's basically just adding a little bit of disclaimer to the, since the Fathom model is still pending being final, but we said previously, we said map interior drainage floodplain downstream of El Paso with Fathom and Fathom assumptions. And what we're talking about modifying that to is, we'll go back and share Brian's screen one more time, is that map interior drainage floodplain downstream of El Paso with modified Fathom assumptions, tentative pending model availability. So the reason we edited that particular bullet is because after discussions with Fathom about what their model assumptions are downstream, and we might be able to use their pluvial modeling for the interior drainage purposes, or we might be able to coordinate with them to change their model, particularly for our interior drainage purposes, since that could be the best available model downstream. So anyways, that last bullet is sort of just tentative and pending. That's why I just wanted to point that out before you all voted on it, and we kept it general for a reason, because this is an approach. This is not an exact process that we're asking you to approve. It's a general approach. So I just wanted to point that out.
We have a choice here. We can either get a motion on this now, or we can wait. We tabled item number 10, which would include this at the next meeting anyway. So we kind of have a choice.
I feel comfortable with moving forward and voting on it as it's shown here, unless somebody else has a different opinion.
Do you want to offer a motion then, Gisela?
Yes, I move to approve the approach to floodplain modeling as noted on this slide. I don't know if that suffices or if I have to be more specific.
Which agenda item would this be falling under, AACOM?
Is this under item 9?
I don't have the agenda in front of me. Brian, can you confirm? I'm not seeing it right away.
I think because we're saying that we want to go ahead and adopt the specific. I thought that we could vote on on 12 ultimately, but we don't want to vote on 10 or 11. Is that right, Richard?
12 was tabled too.
I am pulling up the agenda as well.
Brian, are you able to pull up the agenda?
I can, well,
Sorry, I was on
Or-
mute. Yeah, 1 second. 10 and 11 are, so 10 and 11 were intended to be tabled. Those were pertaining to subcommittee 1, and 12 is what we're discussing now.
okay, just wanted to make sure that's what it was. So then if this is correct, Isela, then I think your motion would be that you would want to confirm the general FMEs and FMS evaluation method proposed during subcommittee 3 meeting.
Okay, move to approve what Annette said.
Is there a second?
Wait a second.
I'll second.
Is that Levi?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any further discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Say aye. Okay, motion passes.
And if I may, just as a reminder, we do have committee members who need to leave by 2:30. So to get through these last agenda items, that's our time frame.
Okay, thank you, Annette, for that reminder. I know, yeah, we are running a little bit behind, so I'll try to speed through the subcommittee 2 updates. Brian, next slide. So subcommittee 2 is focused on identifying, evaluating FMPs, flood mitigation projects. And so this slide just says what requirements are needed in the evaluation of FMPs. And I'll just point out that there are quantitative reports. There's a need for detailed H&H models, and we need to report the benefits for flood reduction to habitable structures, critical facilities, etc. And we also need to demonstrate that there's no impacts caused to neighboring areas, no negative impacts or where flooding is made worse. And we also need to describe the benefits to the environment or water supply or other categories that were discussed. Next slide. So we also looked at some of the TWDB scoring criteria, which will be used to evaluate and rank each of the flood FMPs that we come up with. And we focused on 3 of these that are highlighted here: the water supply benefit, the multiple benefit, and the environmental benefits. We kind of looked at a little bit more detail how TWDB will be evaluating whether each project, has these benefits or not. Next slide. And we discussed some of the stakeholder coordination that's taken place through the public survey, where we reached out to over 250 plus, I believe, stakeholders, and followed up with phone calls with almost all of them, and particularly within El Paso County, which is our most populated area. We had several stakeholders, being the county, which has a recent 2021 stormwater master plan, which has several projects in there that are prioritized and ranked with costs. There's also a 2021 EP Water / City of El Paso stormwater master plan with additional projects within that area. I think 90 plus projects. So those are great starting points, and they are recent documents. So we'll be focusing on those a lot in the EP El Paso County area. We also have been coordinating with EPC WID #1 about some of their main flooding issues, and they coordinate with Hudspeth and Doña Ana counties on irrigation and related issues there. We also discussed some of the communities that responded to the public survey, including Vinton, Socorro, and some of them listed that they do have master plans or CIP lists, as well as proposed or ongoing projects related to flood mitigation. So we mentioned how we will be following up with them to get more information. And lastly, we'll continue to coordinate with USIBWC, the Army Corps, and TxDOT are some other agencies. Next slide. Within the region, obviously, we have all the different counties, the cities and communities. They were all sent the public stakeholder survey. So I think Martin will discuss that from Barracuda a little bit more about what the numbers are on some of the responses, but also some of the state entities that we reached out to and are still reaching out to are TxDOT, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and as well as state parks. And on the federal side, the Army Corps, the U.S. Army facilities such as Fort Bliss, NRCS, USIBWC, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and national parks. Any projects that they have, which may not have flood mitigation as a primary focus, but maybe that's a secondary benefit of reduced flood risk. We want to find out about those projects because they could also be implemented in this plan. So with all of you all, please keep in mind that that survey is still out there. It was trying to close today, but like we said, we'll leave it open. And so please ensure that any stakeholders associated with your organizations or any that you know of, feel free to reach out and say, hey, I don't know if you've talked to this person, but they would be a good person to ask about this organization's projects related to flood mitigation. So that's all I'll say on that. Are there any comments on the subcommittee 2 meeting which took place? All right. With that, I will pass it off to Martin.
Good afternoon, everybody. Martin Bartlett from Barracuda Public Relations. Always good to be with you all to talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing in the background to keep the drumbeat going about the process. Of course, the big item that we all have circled on our calendars right now is that open house style meeting on Wednesday, the 27th from 4 to 7 at the Tech H2O Center. I really want to take my hat off and thank El Paso Water for being such a good partner. I know and that goes from the top to the bottom. We've had some great meetings out there, actually site visiting the facility at Tech H2O and conversations as well with the PIO office about getting the word out. So just a huge thanks to El Paso Water. Of course, we also do recognize we'll be hitting the road again, going maybe a little bit further for some of us to Pecos and Presidio, anticipated in roundabout February of 2022, and then coming back to El Paso for a wrap-up show in early summer 2022. We can move on to any questions about the public meeting, the open house public meeting, before we move on. All right, hearing none, if we can move on to just kind of the stakeholder outreach and the survey that's been out there. Want to let everybody also know we're really going to kind of begin to shift our focus from the survey to really beating the drum about that open house public meeting in a lot of our outreach. That began, we sent, our group sent an email to all elected officials in El Paso County, Hudspeth County, and municipalities therein, reminding them of the public meeting that's coming up on the 27th. Prior to that, we received a lot of really positive coverage from across the region. There you see a selected list of some of the media outlets who have covered the story we've been working on. Also driving folks to the survey, embedding links to the survey and the online map tool into their websites, many of them. And again, as Brian mentioned, we've passed the century mark where we've received about 100 responses to the survey from across the region. And a lot of that has been driven by our stakeholders, but also by paid social media messaging. This map, I am very excited to tell you, I can update in real time. As you can see out there, one lone county where nobody had responded from Crane County, I can now say, pat your backs, pat your friends from Crane County on the back, because Crane County is now on the board. So we've received at least one response from every county in the study area, which for a study area the size of Indiana, I think is no small feat. There you see those highlights in red showing where we did get media coverage, and what you see in blue, the darker the blue, the more survey responses, the lighter the blue, kind of tending more towards aqua, the fewer the survey responses. Of course, El Paso County, the most populous county in the study area. Also fascinated to see those river counties looking at you, Culberson, Presidio, I believe it'd be Brewster kind of coming on with strong responses as well.
All righty, thank you, Martin. Appreciate that update. Now, kind of going to give you an update on what our goal is going to be for our next regional flood planning meeting. Again, just to reiterate, we've got our next meeting scheduled for the 2nd, and the next one's going to be on the 30th of November. We're going to continue having our subcommittee meetings. Subcommittee 1, we're having another meeting on October 21st, and Subcommittee 3 will be October 22nd. Again, we're going to continue our efforts on reaching out to stakeholders to collect the responses. And we're going to continue publicizing all the information and excuse me, and continue publicizing the meeting here. We're going to start consolidating data and getting the results from our survey and our map viewer on there. Again, the survey closes today, but like we had mentioned, it doesn't really close, but it's the last day that we can really guarantee that information is going to get into the flood plan. But we will be accepting responses from there on out. Again, open house October 27th, and we're going to continue working on our task 2. We're going to continue identifying and working on task 3. On identifying the standards in flood mitigation, flood management goals, and recommendations based off of Subcommittee 1 feedback. We're also going to identify and outline flood mitigation needs by subregion, which is part of Task 4A. And finally, Task 4B, we're going to identify and outline potential flood solutions. And in late November, after early November, after our November 2nd meeting, we're going to begin drafting our technical memorandum, which is going to include Task 1 through Task 4B, and our intent is to have that complete, here in early December, to be able to get it out to the regional flood planning group to review and address any comments and they might have, and to be able to submit to Texas Water Development Board by January 7th. So with that being said, that's all we had to offer on our update today. I want to thank you for being here. Thank you, Dave, for running the meeting. And,
Gilbert, I have a question, if I can
yes,
ask. Is there a chance that you might have an early draft of the technical memo available for the 30 November meeting?
We can try, Dave. It's it's a lot of information, but we can surely try, and we can work towards trying to get it to you by that 30th of November. I'm not going to guarantee anything to you at this time, but we can definitely try and get it by then.
Okay. The only reason I was asking that is that would be about 1 month prior to a month and a week or so prior to the 7 January submission, and we would certainly have to have a meeting sometime in December to let the group validate it or agree with it. But I thought it'd really be nice if we could see something on 30 November. If we can't, we can do it in December.
Right, and we'll keep that in mind, Dave. Thank you for bringing it up. That's a good point. We'll keep that in mind, see if we can't get it by then.
Okay, thanks, Gil. And
AECOM, if I can real quick, I'm going to share my screen just to remind everyone that, let's see here. Yeah, if just as a reminder, if you go to the flood planning group website, I went ahead and put the information about the open house on the front. So that'll be the public notice that Barracuda put together. And then also, if you go to your meetings, either meeting notices or I think calendar would be better, just to keep up with the amount of meetings happening. If you click on calendar, we'll have the meetings posted. So we've got the ones coming up for the 21st, 22nd. We've got the open house. And then as we were having this meeting, I went ahead and also just made a notation that we've got the November 2nd meeting, and then we've got the November 30th. So obviously there's no agenda attached to that yet. I don't think we have times identified. So for the November 2nd, do you want to stick with the 10 a.m. or do you want to go afternoon? What do you all think?
And actually, we kind of had them pegged for 9 and 10 the way we had before, but whatever the group wants.
Okay, 9 o'clock. So if I'll just go ahead and revise I'll include the times on the calendar to include the times that have already been notated for 9 a.m. But just as a reminder, in case you all are trying to remember when your meeting is, just go to the website and we'll have this information. The meeting notices, it's the same thing, it's just a different view. So it's a matter of how you want to, where you want to get the information from. I just want to make sure that you know it's available to you.
And let me bring up something, because Dave brought up a good point. I know we have a meeting scheduled for November 30th, but I know we do require to have another meeting on here, and we got to have a vote from the group. What would be a good time to have that next meeting, since we have a deadline of January 7th? The holidays are in the way, and so what's the pleasure of the group on that?
Let me make a comment on that. If we want to allow the group to knowledgeably vote on the technical memo, I think the group needs to see it in a distribution probably at least 5 to 7 days before this whatever meeting we schedule. So it's kind of based on when you guys want to get the memo out to us, and then we could schedule, as long as you can do something to us like a week prior to when the meeting is scheduled, that would work, I'm sure, for everybody.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just comment real quick on that. Brian and I have had some discussions and sort of drafted an email with some proposed dates for some future subcommittee meetings that we're planning on sending to Annette here, I think probably today. But Brian, do you want to talk a little bit about that schedule? The plan was basically you do need 14 days of public notice to allow for public comment on the processes that will be used to come up with FMEs, FMSs, and FMPs. So we are scheduling these final subcommittee meetings before, we call them final meetings before the tech memo, so that we have them all before that November 30th meeting by at least 14 days. So we want to make sure that November 15th would be like the latest we would have any of those last subcommittee meetings. And in those last subcommittee meetings, we want to present our processes for vote. And that would allow us on the 15th or the morning of the 16th to post that process 2 weeks in advance of the November 30th meeting. And then we would get, ideally, have a vote by this general planning group on November 30th on whether those processes, which will have been vetted through the subcommittees at those times, are acceptable. And if they are voted as being acceptable, that will give us sort of the last assurance we needed so that we could put them in the technical memo, which we plan to deliver on December 2nd. And then this flood planning group would have 2 weeks through the 16th, and if they wanted to review that and comment, and we were thinking that on the December 16th or 17th would be the latest that we would want to have that last regional flood planning group meeting, which we would bring the tech memo up for a vote. If there were any final comments that we wanted to be put into the tech memo, we could get that discussed in that final meeting and hopefully approved, so that we could then have everything incorporated and submitted to the Texas Water Development Board by the 7th. And so that was kind of our general plan. Brian, let me know if I got any of that wrong, but yeah, we were kind of aiming for the 16th or the 17th. That would put us a little bit ahead of the holidays, and try to keep our holidays free of any stresses or additional meetings. And then if we needed to schedule, one last meeting, say there were some issues with the tech memo and it wasn't approved on the 17th, we could aim for maybe that first week of January, which we know is cutting it close to the January 7th deadline, but that would be the sort of the worst case scenario.
Let me just add, I believe you mentioned the draft technical memo date was December 2nd. I think what we presented previously was December 3rd, the Friday.
Okay.
That's our target for the technical memo draft to be submitted to RFPG. And I think we can just given what Dave said about the 5 to 7 day review time frame, I think we can shoot for any time the week of the 13th or the 7th through the 17th of December to have that general RFPG meeting to approve the technical memo draft.
Just a comment, if you want us to approve something, we're going to need the group to see what is tentatively for approval a couple of days prior to a scheduled meeting. So if we're going to schedule a meeting, for example, on the 17th of December, we'll need to get something distributed at least by Monday of that week for people to take a look at to see if they have any issues, you know, to review, have a good chance to review things. And the same thing for the meeting on the 30th. If you want us to review something and approve something on the 30th, then something needs to be out several days prior to that to everybody to have a chance to read through it and review or have comments prepared for the approval date.
Agreed. Yeah, what we were suggesting is to have the draft submitted to the group by December 3rd, which would be potentially
2 weeks.
1 to 2 weeks prior to our follow-up meeting. So we did want to provide as much time as possible for the group to review before we meet.
Okay, that sounds fine. It sounds like you're coming. And then if there's something that we have to vote on the 30th, then we'll need the same type of pre-distribution.
Yes, definitely. That's
Right.
also the 14-day requirement that we'll be following for public comment as well for November 30th.
Okay, so we'll expect a draft, the technical memo information by around the 3rd, somewhere around that time.
That's correct.
That sounds reasonable. If anybody has any other thoughts, please bring them up now.
So then I think we just have these last 2 items. But I don't see any old business unless anybody else.
The next item is item 17, discussion of old business. Does anybody have any old business they'd like to bring up? Okay, nothing responded. So item 18 is general public comments. Are there any general public comments?
I think we covered already that date and the agenda items for the next meeting.
And that'd be the 30th, right?
The next one will be the 2nd of November. That's our next
2
meeting.
November. Okay, all right. So we have 2 November at 9 o'clock for the next meeting of the general membership. And that takes care of item 19. If there isn't anything else, item 20, any motion to adjourn?
To adjourn.
Second, I think, was Jeff. Okay.
All right. And all in favor? Say aye, please.
Aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Okay. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.